The story this morning seems to be telling us that some, at least, of what we know about Jesus we learn by the experience of breaking bread together. And I've noticed something. It was brought to my attention again last weekend when Rachel Held Evans was here. Communion seems to be a big thing for folks who are finding their way back to faith communities. It's a big thing. In fact, there's a quote at the beginning of your order of worship this morning from Rachel's spiritual but not religious blog post. There are some days when the promise of communion is the only thing that rouses me from my bed on a Sunday morning. I want a taste of mystery, she says. Now, there's part of that actually mystifies me. I'm among those followers of Jesus who tend to spend a lot of time in the part of the story where the stranger, who turns out to be Jesus, lectures the disciples about Moses and the prophets and all that it means to be Messiah. That's where I spend a lot of my time, with books and study and seminars and sermons. And I am loath to say that that doesn't matter. I mean, after all, here I am. But I have to notice, maybe you did too, that these disciples still don't recognize the stranger even after the lecture. They still don't see him. They don't recognize him to be this risen Jesus until he takes the bread and blesses and breaks it and gives it to them. It isn't until the breaking of the bread part of the story that they actually get it. And maybe you noticed what's missing from this story. The stranger never says, "This is my body broken for you." He never says that. Instead, he just takes the bread and blesses it and breaks it and gives it to them. And then they recognize him. And then he vanishes. Doesn't seem fair, does it? Just when you get it, he vanishes. It's a mystery. There is something mysterious that happens in this action that opens people's eyes in a way they haven't seen it before. Now, if Pastor Ned were here, he is in Maine right now with Bob Siddick at the Alliance of Baptists meeting. If he were here, he might talk about the trajectory of this narrative. It's a journey that isn't just geographical, from Jerusalem to Emmaus, back to Jerusalem again. The journey of this narrative is the distance from "we had hoped" to "they rose and went back to Jerusalem." Do you know that journey? I'm guessing all of us have been on that road at sometime in our lives. We had hoped this was the job. We had hoped that this was the relationship. We hoped that this was the community. We had hoped that this new location or situation would finally make sense of our lives. And like the disciples, we find ourselves asking, are you the only one who has not seen all of this come crashing down around us? We find ourselves on the road, traveling the distance between our disappointed hopes and getting up again. And we discover that perhaps all we have to depend on along the way is the kindness of strangers. People who don't recognize at first, people who are unfamiliar to us, people we don't know, but somehow mysteriously end up being companions with us on the journey. And what's in the middle of that journey, in the story this morning, is the experience of the recognition that comes with breaking bread together. And these two disciples end up having their own resurrection story to tell. They rose from their disappointed hopes and headed back to Jerusalem, where the story of Jesus begins all over again. Gretchen gathered us this morning by reminding us of the story Rachel Held Evans told last week about serving communion to junior high youth. It sounds dicey to me. As she offered the bread, she says, in their faces I saw relief, joy, sadness, distraction, eagerness, shyness, familiarity, boredom, peace, fear, and hope. So much hope. I saw broken families and fights with friends and doubts about God and insecurities about the van ride home. I saw the longing to start over again, the longing to be known. Between all the experiences of the past and the van ride home, there was this act of breaking bread together, and in it the recognition of so much hope, eyes open to this longing to start over again. So Rachel's story got me thinking about and rethinking about communion. Not just what I know of all the things I've studied over the years, there's been a lot. All the fights, if you study communion too long, you discover that this table is a minefield. Disagreements about what's happening here, about who should do it, about who should take it. So I decided to leave all that behind and just figure out what it is I'm learning to recognize from my experience of it. Several years ago, I worked for an organization that offered spiritual support to gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender folks. Many of those folks, not surprisingly, had powerfully painful stories to tell about their churches and their families and their own lives. What they had hoped of love and welcome and affirmation had been dashed, and what they were looking for now was a new beginning for their lives. So, from time to time, we led discussion groups and study groups. We brought in special speakers to talk about the Bible and sexual orientation and gender identity. We offered support groups of various kinds. And the one thing we always did when we gathered for worship was to share communion. Some of these folks have been denied communion over the years, or at least had been made to feel unworthy of it. You could see how important it was as people came forward, so much disappointment and sadness and fear in those faces, and all the hope that they had, so much hope to start over again. My colleague was famous for saying to people as they came, "God is wildly in love with you." Well, that made people's eyes big. They tried to take it in, sometimes with tears, sometimes an awkward smile. Sometimes people would just turn away quickly because it was just too much to believe. Now, my colleague was a former youth pastor. She was fun and a creative person, and sometimes that creativity got the best of her. One evening when I was scheduled to do communion, she gave me a cryptic heads up that there was going to be a little surprise for tonight's communion. Okay, I thought, something a little different. I stood up to introduce communion, and I saw that there were two figures waiting at the back of the sanctuary to come down the aisle to help me serve. It took me a while to recognize what it was I was seeing. Then it registered. Waiting to serve communion with me were two people dressed in giant grape cluster costumes. Do you have a mental image of this? The feet hanging out and the arms out, but everything else, these gigantic round balls of a grape cluster, right down to the little hat with the stem. It was exactly those guys from the Fruit of the Loom commercial. I was dumbstruck. What do you say? And the two Fruit of the Loom figures came down the center aisle. The crowd gasped. There was a look of horror that went through the crowd, and then sort of nervous laughter. And then I saw several people walk out. To be honest, I'm not really sure how I managed to get through that. My colleague later apologized. But I learned something important that night. Something maybe I really hadn't known before, or maybe had not really thought about. That I had been taking this promise of communion not seriously enough. That there was a kind of mystery in this breaking bread. That the promise of love and welcome and a new beginning isn't something to be taken lightly. There may be joy in it, but friends, it is no joke. It's something that we do over and over again, not to tame it, and for God's sake, not to get it right. But as Rachel says, we keep doing it over and over again until we believe the mystery of it. That in the face of our own disappointments about the church and our families, and maybe even our own lives, we are being offered the sacred promise that we can begin again. And then I think it was 3 years ago I learned something else about the experience of communion. I think that was the year, maybe you know, that was the year that we started hosting the 4th of July picnic in the parking lot. Was that 3 years ago? 4 years ago. We welcomed all our neighbors, especially our neighbors living on the streets and in shelter. It's a beautiful scene. I hope you'll help us this year. It's a beautiful scene. All kinds of people out there in the parking lot eating, a huge abundance of food that people have brought. There's massage therapists who donate their time to do massage. You know what it must be like for someone who's been living on the streets to be touched in that healing way? Imagine. There's music, and there's dancing. Yes, Baptist dance. Not well, but we dance. There's haircuts, and there's just plain time together. The experience reminded me that in the story of Luke Acts, there are 2 separate books in the New Testament, but they tell us that they're written by the same author. They're sort of a chronological continuation of the story of Jesus. There are 2 kinds of breaking bread. There's the mysterious one in Luke 24 about hope rising out of the disappointment in our own lives, and there's the social one in Acts 2, where the first community of Jesus sold their possessions, and now look out. The social version of breaking bread, where the community of Jesus sold their possessions and goods and gave to everyone who had need, and they continued daily in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They ate together with gladness and singleness of heart. 2 forms of communion. For Luke, Acts, the promise of breaking bread is not only about the hope we have for ourselves, but the vision we have for the world. And to return to our new friend, Rachel Held Evans, she reminds us that earlier in Luke chapters 13 and 14, Jesus says that the kingdom of God, this evolving, beloved community, is like a great feast to which all the world is coming. The Apostle John called it the marriage supper of the Lamb, she says. Baptists call it one eternal potluck. And it's a potluck because it isn't just about feeding people, she says. It's about dining together, sitting next to one another and brushing arms, passing the bread basket, and sharing the artichoke dip. It means double dipping and spilling drinks, laughing together and crying together, exchanging stories, ideas, recipes, and dreams. Dining together isn't charity, it's friendship. What I'm learning about communion is that it isn't just what happens at this table. It's what can happen at every table where we share food and time and ourselves in the hope that a world of hospitality and generosity and friendship can begin all over again. Now, there's one more place where I'm still learning about communion. It's a more recent experience, and it happened the first time I visited our sisters and brothers at Bet Aleph Meditative Synagogue. After the Shabbat service, several people invited me to the oneg that followed. I figured it's like our coffee hour. There would be coffee and goodies and time to talk. And it's true, there was. But the oneg starts in a very particular way. The special bread, challah, is taken, and everyone shares a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lehem min haaretz. Blessed be the Eternal One who brings forth bread from the earth, and then we break it, and then everyone shares it. And then there's a cup of wine or juice, and another blessing is said, and then everyone drinks together like it's a great toast to life. Now, the first time I found myself there, I said, my God, it's communion. And it is. All the kids were running around, and I'm so happy to say it. They're running around, but they too shared in the bread and the juice, and they knew the words to the blessing. Oh, I hope this for us. That our kids share the bread and the cup, and they know the words to the blessings. There was laughter in one corner and a serious conversation in another. Over there, someone was invoking the memory of one who had died, and all over the room there was this great chaos that I can only imagine to be the kind of energy out of which the world might be created all over again. Because that's how it happened. So when I come to this table, I bring not only my studies, for whatever they're worth, but myself, which I've been told is worth a lot. I bring the journeys I have traveled between disappointed hopes and getting up again. I bring the image of tables in the parking lot and the vision of that great eternal potluck. I bring the experience of a community of all ages who know what it is to share the bread and the cup, and they know the words to the blessings. Now, I don't know what got you out of bed this morning. Unlike Rachel, maybe it wasn't communion. Maybe it was routine or obligation or some vague need to wake up your soul. Whatever it was, I'm glad you're here. Because the first step in communion is to show up. To show up to your life. To show up to each other. To show up in the world. And when we do, what we might see in the faces around this table, even in the faces of strangers, is something we might recognize of ourselves. Relief, joy, sadness, distraction, eagerness, shyness, familiarity, boredom, peace, fear. We might see broken families and fights with friends and doubts about God and insecurities about that ride home. And hope. So much hope. Longing to start over again. And what we have to offer one another are a few words and this broken bread and this mysterious hope that you can rise out of your disappointments about your life or the world or this community to begin again. So, now we begin. And today, if you hear that voice that says that every moment of your life is the beginning, there is no journey gone so far we cannot stop and change direction. If you hear that voice in the music of your own soul, well, what do? You do not